everyone to this Canberra Times annual alumni literary event in the Meet the Author series. My name is Fiona Wheeler and I'm here in my capacity as Acting Dean of the ANU College of Law. And, dare I say, High Court aficionado, in the sense that I've devoted a large part of my adult life studying our highest court and its judges. So it gives me special pleasure that not only are we meeting the author, Professor A.J. Brown, this evening, but we also have the very great privilege of meeting his subject, the Honourable Michael Kirby. And together, in great style, as you can see, they'll be in conversation, with the occasional question from me about AJ's new book, Michael Kirby Paradoxes and Principles, released just the week before last by the Federation Press. Now, before this particular audience, I'm delighted to say that the book has multiple ANU connections, including that AJ is an ANU alumnus, and indeed he features in the alumni newsletter that I received on Friday in the Where Are They Now column. The answer to that particular question, where is he now, apart from being here with us this evening, is that AJ holds the John F. Kearney Chair of Law at Griffith University, where his highly regarded scholarship bridges the worlds of public law, political science, public administration, and of course, he now adds to that judicial biography. For part of the time, however, that he was working on Michael Kirby Paradoxes and Principles, he was a visiting fellow at the ANU College of Law, and I recall many corridor conversations with AJ about how the Kirby biography was going. A further ANU connection that I know that AJ would like me to mention is the contribution that my colleague, Dr. Heather Roberts, made to the project, and AJ's acknowledgement section records her part in bringing the book to fruition. So AJ, welcome back to ANU. Now, introducing AJ is the easy bit. I'm not sure how one introduces Michael Kirby. Lawyer, judge, public intellectual, he is quite simply Michael Kirby, whose remarkable life story from his childhood in Sydney to the High Court and beyond forms the subject of AJ's book. I'm pleased to say that Michael also has ANU connections. In particular, he's a great friend of the ANU College of Law, and when he comes to speak with our students, the lecture theatre fills to overflowing, very much like tonight's venue. And that, of course, is a very practical expression of the esteem in which he is held. So, welcome, Michael, and we're very grateful that you're able to join us. So, let me hand over to the duo that you've come to hear. And to get the conversation underway, I'd like to ask AJ to share with us something about the background to the book. In particular, what inspired you to take on this project, and how and to what extent you worked with Michael along the way. You're still clearly great friends, so that's
why did it take 7 years? Why did it take 7 years?
Thank you. Thank you, Fiona. Can everybody hear up the back? Is that okay? Excellent, very good. Thank you to Fiona, and thank you very much to the ANU for hosting, and big thank you to Heather, who will probably get mentioned again. I may be able to blame a few things on Heather along the way. But the beginnings of the project really came from always having been quite perplexed by Michael Kirby, even though I'd always been impressed by Michael Kirby. I grew up in Canberra, and anybody who grew up in Canberra in the 70s and early 80s was subjected to Michael's media persona, even more than the rest of the country, because when he was chairman of the Law Reform Commission in that time, he had special roles for the ACT. So I know that a lot of people here will know what I'm talking about. But when I first met him as a first-year law student in 1986, the Michael Kirby that I first met was very different in person to the Michael Kirby that I knew as the crusading law reformer, as a persona on television, partly manufactured by television rather than anything else. But the idea for actually doing the book, I would never have predicted it, but the idea for doing the book came about in late 2002 when I was having a dinner conversation with Michael. I think it was after the retirement of a mutual friend, a law professor, a mentor of mine, Dirk Muir, and Michael happened to mention that people were approaching him to cooperate with a biography of him, but that they were all journalists. No offence to journalists who, of course...
No offence to journalists.
Yeah, and many of you will know why I'm saying no offence to journalists. But I actually thought at that point, well, if all it takes is a lawyer rather than a journalist to write it, then I would have to at least have as good a chance as anybody else to write a biography of Michael which was accurate and delved into what was so perplexing about him, rather than just being a biography that assumed that everything about Michael was automatically beyond question. And I don't think Michael would have ever wanted somebody to write a biography that... Well, that's what anyway, at the time, Michael said he wouldn't have wanted anybody to write a biography which took an approach which didn't question things. So that was really the beginning. He did say right back at the beginning, and I have it in writing, but do you really think you could do it, warts and all? And so that's my primary evidence in my own defence now. But along the way, it was fascinating. I mean, we could talk about the cooperation and how it worked quite a bit. But on one hand, Michael's generosity, which is legendary in a number of respects, was absolutely true of cooperation with the book in all sorts of ways that were really a treasure trove for a researcher and a political scientist. But at the same time, he had no control over what I did. Is that a fair summation?
No control whatsoever. But AJ gave 7 long years of his life slaving on this book, and there are a number of judgments that he has expressed that are deeply hurtful to me. And I myself don't find myself to be paradoxical or perplexing any more than all the rest of you are. I mean, all of us have aspects of our lives that may seem to an outsider to be a bit unusual, but we in our own minds can see how it all fits together. And so I don't really see the paradoxes, but that is the main theme of this book, and it's a bit weird actually to be looking at somebody else analysing your personality and your life and bringing out aspects of it which don't seem to be terribly important, or understating aspects that do seem important, but that is AJ's right. In the High Court, next only perhaps to Michael McHugh as a justice, I was always the most defensive of free speech and of the right of free expression and free opinions, and I think if you analyse the cases, that's how I came out. So I was not going to load him up or interfere. I made some humble factual suggestions on some early drafts, and I made a few content suggestions which were peremptorily dismissed. But the net product is, for me, quite an interesting exercise in looking at yourself, and we all know that we are often the last person who should judge ourselves. So there it is, warts and all, it's all in there, and AJ has done a pretty good job, I'd say. Certainly, it's a good read. I mean, I have to say that about AJ. His father was a journo, and a very distinguished one in this city, and he's a very good writer. It's very well written. It's not turgid and not dry.
Michael, what did you learn about the Honourable Michael Kirby from reading the book?
Well, I learned various factual things of people's comments on events in my life. For example, during the Heffernan affair, as it can be called, I myself was not closely involved. I had respect for my colleagues, and so I didn't get too close to them, and they were going through the terrible process of an assault on the institution of the High Court of Australia, and in fairness to them, it was a completely unprecedented event that had never happened, not only in our highest court or in the highest court of Britain or Canada or New Zealand, unthinkable. So that I saw what was happening behind the curtain and in respect of their interreactions with each other during that time, and that was something entirely new and to me revelatory of it, and can I say revealed what a sterling person Justice Mary Gaudron was and is. She's a very feisty lady. She can be very, very difficult, but she is a person of great honour and integrity, and I learned a lot about her, not only from her recent biography by Patricia Burton, but also from this biography written by A.J. Brown, based on lengthy conversations with Mary Gaudron, which happily she gave.
AJ, we've already mentioned the paradoxes that you see in Michael Kirby. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about those paradoxes as you see them, and in particular, how you think they've shaped Michael's life story?
Yeah, I should say that I hope that by the end of the book, I've tried to resolve these paradoxes. The end of the book, I mean, really the beginning of the book, if you like, is the paradoxes. That's the driver. But the end of the book, by the time you get to the end of the book, you'll understand what the principles is about, because it really is, in terms of understanding those paradoxes, really what I was fascinated by in trying to figure out this apparent contradiction between the public persona of Michael Kirby as a radical. I mean, Pamela Burton in her biography of Mary Gaudron just subscribes to the normal assumption by describing Michael as the radical jurist, the arrival of the radical jurist, Michael Kirby, on the High Court. And that's a common assumption, but the reality is, when you understand Michael, and I suspect he's about to say at least 7 things which will back this up, his fundamental faith in the basic existing principles, institutions of our society is almost indestructible. And so it's trying to figure out how somebody could have so much faith in existing institutions, be so traditionalist in a classic small L liberal sense, which has an enormous capacity for being progressive and wanting to be progressive in a very much a sense of we can better ourselves, we can better society, and this is how we will do it. But that it's really a very traditionalist approach, which is very, very optimistic about our existing major institutions. So the question of when and how you change your institutions, that's really what this amazing career has been about, is about, well, how do we go about establishing that something needs to change? And the answer is, well, you figure out what the principles are, what the first principles are, with reference to this situation. And I suppose what I tried to do in the book was chart the way in which both this amazing public persona has unfolded, and also the way in which those, where did that, what was the real talent behind that? And that really, the judgment I come to is that really is the big and amazing talent. And then how was that talent shaped? And that's an amazing part of the story, because you can track it right back to Michael's childhood and his father and his student politics, and so I think by the end I feel like I arrived at the answer, and so hopefully other people will arrive at their own answer, and you can decide whether it's the same one as me. But But
Well-
at the end, I certainly didn't come away with any less of a respect for the incredible impact that all of those features have had and their significance for Australian society. Where that all takes us, I think, is the big question. Why is it that that Michael has resonated so much with Australian society in the way in which he's used those skills to talk back with Australian society about its own institutions and its own law and its own dynamics? It's been truly fascinating.
But why wouldn't I be optimistic and confident about our basic institutions? I mean, why, especially in Canberra, where I worked with some of the most wonderful people in the public sector, people of great dedication, of great idealism, of really hard work, working in institutions which were not corrupted. I mean, I had disputes with my judicial colleagues, but never for a second did I ever think that any of them was not a person of great integrity, of great learning, of hard work, doing their thing according to their values and their understanding of the law. If you have that experience at the top level with our institutions, you know weaknesses and flaws, and you know that there are no things that need to be improved, but you can have a great we are one of the best governed countries in the world, and we have really strong institutions. So why shouldn't I? I don't find it paradoxical. I don't find it perplexing. Now, Fiona, you can just tell us between yourself. You've been within the High Court. You've been an associate. You've worked there. You've studied it all these years. Why would I not be confident and why would I not believe that we can improve it, we can get it better, we can get it more transparent, but the fundamentals are tremendously strong in Australia, I reckon, and the centre point of it is here in Canberra, with the marvellous, honourable, professional public service that serves the whole nation. I just don't find that a paradox. Does anybody find it a paradox? Don't answer that question. Buy the book. See the injustice.
Michael, since we are talking about biography, and this book charts your life, from, as I said, from your childhood in Concord in Sydney. Where do your principles and your values come from? I mean, what has forged this particular outlook on life and this optimism about our institutions?
I grew up always surrounded by love. I had dinner last night with my dad in Sydney. He's 95. He got his driver's licence again last week. He's a person of great intelligence. My mother was greatly loving. I never doubted love. Now, that's a wonderful thing if you have that to start with. And some gay people don't get that. You know, they're rejected by their family, which is a terrible and shocking and wicked thing. But I was always surrounded by love. I had marvellous teachers in public schools. 67% of our people go to public education. And I'm so angry at the fact that people who took advantage of public education denigrate it and write it down. People who've had the advantage don't follow through and give proper funding. And we're now destroying even the secular principle in public education and in our society, which we mustn't do. But when I was growing up, when I was about 7, I didn't go to the Anglican church down the road, which was my denomination, but I was sent up the hill to the Wesley Methodist Church. It's now a Korean Australian Methodist church in Concord, lovely church, and I began singing those John Wesley hymns. And in my school magazine, in the year 1946 or 7, we had one of the great hymns of the Wesleyan tradition, "These things shall be. These things shall be, a loftier race than all the world has known shall rise, with flame of freedom in their souls and light of science in their eyes." What marvellous confidence of the flame of liberty, and that was at the time I was learning about Eleanor Roosevelt's Universal Declaration, and the light of science in our eyes, the great confidence that our species is a species that can improve itself and can improve itself in many things, including in the law. So I give a lot of credit to the Methos. I wasn't a Metho myself, but it was a safe church just up the top of the hill, and I still think that gave me the spirit of confidence and optimism, and I'm still optimistic. I still am optimistic about getting our society better. And we've got to be more feel-good in Australia, instead of always the spin and nastiness that sometimes assigns public discourse at the moment.
The other thing I learnt, Fiona, which was the great privilege of being able to do a biography of somebody who was aged sort of around 70.
Very young.
Very young. But to have their father not only still on this planet, but as absolutely sharp as a tack. And the really interesting thing about that was that when I was able to interview Don Kirby, who was an amazing man, in the house in Sydney Street, Concord, where the family had lived since 1942, and he's still there. So it was like stepping back in, over 50 years.
My father's still there. I did ultimately move out.
Ultimately. That's covered in the book, how they eventually got him out.
Thrown out. I was thrown out into the cold.
The values...
At the tender age of...
28. What are you laughing about?
But the values in Sydney Street were quite fascinating, because Don Kirby revealed to me that it was understood within the family, certainly Michael's brother David told me this, that he understood that everybody voted Labor in the family. But Don Kirby said to me, no, Jean, Michael's mother, she never voted Labor. She would never have voted Labor. The family story was that Don followed Jean into the polling booth to make sure she voted Labor, and Don just laughed at that and said, no, she always voted Liberal. She would never have voted Labor in her life, and he just laughed and said, she cancelled me out, and it was a classic indicator of what it was a very unique household in that, many people have probably heard the story of Michael's step-grandfather, who was the treasurer of the Australian Communist Party, that this was, and the attempted banning of the Communist Party was occurring in 1949, 1950 through to 51, when Michael was 10, 11, 12. And literally on the first federal election that would have been within your memory, 1949, which was the general election where Robert Menzies was elected for the first time as the leader of the new Liberal Party. In the course of that campaign, Michael was out helping Jack Simpson, his step-grandfather, post up Australian Communist Party posters around Tempe in Western Sydney. But at the same time, as he reliably informed everybody, in fact, he was supporting Menzies to actually get elected. And
he promised child endowment for the eldest child. And as I was the eldest child, we had been denied child endowment. Value back in the pound and child endowment.
You can see what an amazing sort of cusp this was in terms of social influences and political influences, and why it produced, in combination with the Methodists and I think a whole range of factors, it produced this person with this amazing ability to then go back and say, well, what are the first principles? Let's work out the political principles from scratch that need to apply to this situation. And then his skill in that, and the force with which he's done that through his career, which many people will admire, I certainly admire, has also been, as is explained through the course of the book, some of the causes of some of the biggest tensions that have run through some of the way in which he's interacted with other judicial colleagues, for example, through his career. So there's another side to that in the book, which people will come to understand. But certainly that's the force of that. I trace it right back to that sort of environment, and parents whose own sense of principles was very, very strong indeed.
Well, look, you mentioned those judicial tensions. Let's leap forward because in the section of the book that deals with Michael's 13 years on the High Court, you say of that period, and I quote, and this passage really stood out for me. You say, for the first time in his life, and you're speaking, of course, of Michael, he found himself within a professional dynamic to which he would never fully adjust and which he never accepted. Now, that strikes me as quite a remarkable statement to make about someone who was long talked about as destined for a seat on the High Court. Can you explain the basis of that particular
Certainly.
claim?
Michael will deny this and he will disagree with it out of respect for his judicial colleagues and the institutions, if nothing else. But and he's free to do that, of course.
Thank you.
But no, what I was really describing...
It's quite remarkable. It really...
Yeah. I mean, what I was really describing there is the fact that Michael Kirby went from being... well, you've got to really go back to 1983 when Michael was first appointed to the Federal Court after having been Mr Justice Kirby and the Chairman of the Law Reform Commission for so many years. And there was certainly the view afoot in the legal profession that for a lot of that period of time, Michael was not in fact a real judge because his judicial status was owed to being a Deputy President of the Conciliation and Arbitration Commission, etc. When Gareth Evans appointed him to the Federal Court in 1983 when the Hawke government was first elected and launched your book, his media release said Australia's best known judge, Michael Kirby launched, Australia's best known judge will now have judicial office. And that in itself was a sort of a pointer to the fact that much of the traditional legal profession was sceptical and somewhat critical of the fact that judicial office had been used so powerfully by Michael as part of the way in which he had got attention onto law reform issues, as was his mission as Chairman of the Law Reform Commission. But then he went on to being the President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal and being the second most senior judge in Australia's busiest appellate court in Sydney. The President of that court, of the busiest appellate court, the second most senior judge in the state, behind the Chief Justice, and very much running the whole show. And the book really describes how, contrary to whatever scepticism there was amongst the judiciary and the legal profession, how Michael overcame that and established the reputation that he did as President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal. But then he went from being in that role, which was not only a role where he was the chief of his own court, the president of his own court, but also able to make sure that he could run the business of that court in a way which produced the best possible court and his own best personal contribution to the workings of that court. But also, it enabled him to have the flexibility to be the Michael Kirby, the public intellectual, the United Nations Secretary-General's Special Representative for Human Rights in Cambodia, human rights advocate right across the board, world leader in raising awareness about the human rights implications of HIV/AIDS, all these amazing contributions which are spelt out in the book. Really, a lot of them were only possible because of the fact that he was the chief of his own court. Then he became the most junior of 7 judges on the High Court, unable to run the show, and confronted with the fact that, as his other judges are quoted as saying in the book, both to me directly and to Michael, in the course of things, that this was a court of gladiators, is what Michael McHugh told you. Gladiators, 7 judges who, like gladiators, come out of their castles, do battle during the day and then go back into their castles. Or Mary Gaudron said to me, "You have to understand, if you know Mary Gaudron, you'll know why I start doing this." You have to understand, nobody on the High Court has an ego any less in size than courtroom number 1. And many of you will have been in courtroom number 1, and you know that it's about twice as big as this. And the reality was that this was a dynamic, even from the beginning, where all of these things were going to mean a totally different working dynamic. And so even though Michael will put the best face, as he should, and hopefully I'll put a fair face on those years on the High Court, that really set up a dynamic that meant that as the years of the Howard government rolled past and as more and more judges were appointed by the Howard government, who were, let's face it, by definition, unlikely to have the same mix of values as Michael Kirby, if anybody could have the same mix of values as Michael Kirby, then it was going to make for a very challenging professional dynamic. And really, in the book, what I try to do is spell out right to the end how the Michael Kirby that everybody knows and many people love as the greatest dissenter in the history of the High Court, for example, was a role that he never actually wanted. You can see he's wounded, and it's true because it's a role that he never actually wanted, was never actually comfortable with. And so to be remembered that way is not something that Michael is actually comfortable with. And he can
Fiona,
take over.
You would be able to answer that. Now, if I had been on the Mason High Court under Sir Anthony Mason, a great Chief Justice of our country, if I had been in that year, would I have been out of place? Would I have been... this is what I often ask myself, am I just a disagreeable old curmudgeon? Am I being difficult? And then I would remind myself, in the Law Reform Commission, we had our differences, but it was all congenial and we sorted them out, and I was one of the team, and we created a very important national institution which is still going strong. Well, it's been a little bit damaged by lack of funding, but it's still there and has been respected by both sides of politics. And in the Court of Appeal, it is true, when I arrived, there were a lot of people very suspicious of me. I was, after all, younger than any of the judges. They were all people of very great talent. It was a very evenly balanced court there were about the same number of liberals and the same number of conservatives. And therefore we had to sort things out. Was I the big dissenter there? No, I wasn't. I had my share of dissent, no more than Justice McHugh had in the High Court of Australia. But then I got to the High Court, and a very unfortunate thing happened there within the first week. There was an editorial that in the Sydney Morning Herald that was headed, "The Kirby Court." Now, that was not a good career move. And I had nothing to do with it. I didn't write it, but I think that hurt some of my colleagues who are very distinguished lawyers, and I think it was a bit unfortunate. But the one thing we can say about our courts, and about the High Court of Australia particularly, is it is not Tammany Hall. You're not over there on the lake saying, you agree with me on this one and I'll trade that off and agree with you next week. That happens in the other place, but it doesn't happen in our courts. Our judges are supposed to be people of integrity who say what they honestly think. And that is what I had to do. And your life is easy if you agree. You just send round a one-pager which says, I agree with Justice X. That's it. But when you don't agree, either with the conclusion or with the way it's reasoned, you've got to work very hard. You've got to do it yourself. And so I ask myself, am I just a difficult person? Have I changed in the course of my life? I don't think I had. I just think that in the way it happens, and I'm a professional, I know how it happens. We had a government which was very determined, following the Mabo decision and the Wick decision, to appoint people who were of a conservative disposition. And anyone in this audience who thinks that judges are just there on automatic pilot or that cases solve themselves don't really understand the nature of decision making, especially the higher up you get, where there is no binding principle, no governing rule, and you've got to work it all out from basic concepts of what Australia is like as a society and what the decision should be. So I really don't think that I was a particularly difficult person or especially dissenting. Had I been there during the Mason Court, I think I would have agreed with virtually all of those great cases. But it was my fate to be there at the very end of that period and then to carry over into another era. And maybe my role in life was then to express a different philosophy, different values. That's the wonder of our court. And we have uncorrupted judges who do that. I think that was my role. Now, I must pay a tribute to Heather Roberts here. She, I know, is going to write the wonderful essay and biography of Justice Dean, though she's not getting much cooperation from him. He's a bit like Mary Gaudron. He doesn't think it should be written, but I think it should, because if there was one judge I always felt close to when I read his opinions, it was Bill Dean. I mean, his values, though he had had a Catholic upbringing and I'd had a Protestant upbringing, he was a very socially conscious man and very concerned about the disadvantages in the law and the values that impinge upon the minorities. And that was where I was coming from. So if I'd been there, I would have just been sending a flurry of confetti. I agree with Dean. But that wasn't to be my fate.
I think that's very true. I mean, and George Williams and others have said the same thing, that if that had been the situation, if Michael had been on the High Court in those years, he would have been very much in the mainstream. And I mean, I suspect that in some cases he may well have been, history might have recorded him as being somewhat more conservative than it has.
I think that's
as a
right.
consequence.
I think that's
because
right.
history certainly recorded that in relation to some decisions in the New South Wales Court of Appeal.
But I was there under orders. I had to comply with the binding authority of the High Court, and I did.
Well, that's discussed a little bit in the book too. But I think the interesting thing is, and Michael and I have been having this conversation, is that as George and others have said, generally speaking, in a court, in a multi-member court, if there's a general sort of move in a particular direction, a court's getting more conservative or a court's getting more activist, then there tends to be, normally most judges will sort of move some way with that general shift, and you can see that in the Brandon Court and the Gleeson Court, and you can see it now in the French Court. And the interesting thing is that, is that then the question is, well, which judges don't go with that shift? And in the period of the Gleeson Court, during the Howard years, what really stands out in the book, I think, is that the way that Michael interpreted it is that he just stayed put. He stayed on track. Consequently, he ended up being the dissenter. When the court moved in a more conservative technical directions, he became the dissenter just by virtue of staying on track. In the book, I think I provide the evidence that supports that, but I also do suggest, especially in his last few years, because there's a story that hasn't been told yet about the point at which Michael almost retired early, which most people don't even know about, which is in the book, which would horrify most people to think that he might have retired early.
Well, it wouldn't horrify everybody.
Not everybody. Most people here, I suspect, would have been mortified to think that he was going to run out on a fair and decent society and ditch the High Court early. But I detail that in the book, and certainly after that point, for those last few years, 2006, 2007 in particular, what I describe in the book, and these are the parts of the book that helped me research, because these are the parts of the book where we had privileged access that nobody else has really ever had before to what was going on within Michael's chambers, his draft judgments and associate memos and a range of things which normally get shredded, and which we persuaded Michael to hang on to and let us have a look at, so we could really see what was going on in the dynamics of the court. And I mean, I describe it as basically Michael having decided that he was heading into a battle royal, and then the court produced in that period the decisions that it did with the types of judgments that he produced. So that's all fascinating for lawyers, but I think it's also important for non-lawyers, because for all the reasons that Michael has said, especially the High Court is such an important institution for people to understand and think about. Everybody from every walk of life, whether you're a lawyer or a politics junkie or whatever. And so what I really wanted to do, which was always a big part of the project, was to use Michael's generosity in cooperating with the project to open up that world in ways that hadn't been done before. People have done great work on the High Court, but in terms of trying to open up to a broader audience some of the political dynamics of how the place works, it's the sort of thing, if I'd been Michael's associate, I would have had signed a confidentiality agreement, and I would never have been able to talk about it. But because I was effectively, Heather and I, others were like flies on the wall to some extent of what was going on, and we were there for research purposes. So we couldn't publish any of it till after Michael had retired, and Michael was very careful in not giving access to confidential material from others in the court, because they wouldn't have known about it. Therefore, they wouldn't have had the opportunity to consent to it. But But there was enough there. Let's shall we say, there was enough there to tell a pretty significant piece of history in that sort of detail.
In the Supreme Court of the United States, they keep all the memoranda and the drafts. You see, you go through about 10 drafts before you get the final product. And I continued to shred the opinions of my colleagues, but I kept my own because AJ said, why should this be destroyed? It's part of history and it's part of the evolution of opinions, and I think it does have a historical value, and therefore I think that was a good thing that AJ persuaded me to do. And there's one photograph actually of a draft with all the writing on it, which is even to me quite an interesting remembrance of the way in which
most of them were much more undecipherable than the one that's got the picture in the book. Well, I actually had a question for Michael, which is whether, as a result of having done this, you think that all of your former and current and future judicial colleagues are going to, is us having done this going to result in everybody absolutely shredding everything and never letting anybody get access to anything at all ever again, which is sort of the US reaction to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange? Or is it, do you think that this will be an incentive, which I hope, for more judges to keep more of their material and open it up to more analysis and research? And
well, I think that will depend on the type of people who are appointed to the court. People who are liberals and realists and believe that the institution is so strong it doesn't need to pretend that decisions just emerge like Thisbe, perfectly formed, and that it's not a matter of evolution and so on. They will keep the documents and allow others to see them, as all the justices do in the Supreme Court of the United States. But our tradition has been one of a relatively secret bureaucracy. We're now improving that in the executive branch and in the legislative branch, and I think it's in due course the judicial branch will follow, but it'll take time, and I suspect that at the moment I'm the dissenting member of the High Court on that point.
Well, look, let's change tack slightly, because as a reader, the biographies that I find most rewarding are those that provide a window into the inner life of the subject, so the highs and lows, the joys and sorrows that make us all human. And this book does provide such a window, particularly into your relationship with Johan and the impact on you both in all manner of ways of discrimination against same-sex relationships. So I wanted to ask you how well you think AJ has captured that aspect of the book and what message you hope readers will take away from it.
Well, Yaron is a very private person, and he knows, he's very intelligent, and he knows if he becomes a public person, then he's fair game, and therefore he's been very cautious and has never given interviews or said things publicly or involved himself with the media and so on. But he did agree to be interviewed by that program on Compass, which was a television, a 1-hour television program, and he did agree to be interviewed by AJ. And I think AJ has revealed what a strong person he is, what an intelligent person he is, but what a slightly different person, because he comes from the Netherlands culture. And he is a bit in your face, and he's very in your face to me, and my whole family's got used to in your face. I used to say to him when he'd say something, couldn't you find a way to go around that and sort of put it a little diplomatically? And he would say, rubbish. That's you Anglos, you're very, very nice to people's faces and then you stab them in the back. And we have to admit there's a bit of truth in that. But I think he's captured, and first of all, there are some terrific photos in the book that show what a good looker he was. He went to Dimmicks the other day to buy it and revealed that he was the partner, and they said, oh, you're the one on the back cover. And he said, yes, before the bus hit me. So everyone likes Yaron, all the justices, from the Queen, the Governors General, the Prime Ministers, everyone who's dealt with him likes him. It's only me some of them can't stand. But I think AJ's got him pretty right. Strong, intelligent, faithful, caring, loving, and critical, which is what everyone in this room should have if you can find it. Not everybody finds it in life, and it's not something one should reproach oneself if one doesn't find it. But if you find it, it's a wonderful human thing. It's good for your physical health, it's good for your mental health, and everyone should have it, and it should be respected. It should be respected by your society. It should be given equal dignity and equal rights in the law. And that isn't yet the case in our country. Catholic Spain, Catholic Portugal, Catholic Argentina, and I read this morning Uruguay have moved to respecting the relationships of people who happen to be gay, and we haven't got it. Why can't we in Australia get there? We once were in the front of everybody in social things, but now we're told on both sides of politics, oh no, that can't be done. And basically it's because of a breakdown of the secular principle as it applies in this area. If you don't like it, you don't have to do it. But if it is important to you, then every citizen, it's a legal status, it should be equal to every citizen in this fair country, but it's not. At the moment, it's not.
Well, look, why don't we open up the conversation to others at this point, because Michael and AJ have agreed to take some questions. So is there anyone who'd... I saw a hand there, and then there's one up the very back, so at the front. You'll have to speak loudly, though, so the others can hear.
The whole thing about gay marriage, I think it's a bit like the euthanasia debate in Australia. I think the majority of Australians want it, but somehow the politicians haven't got that message. I mean, we should have a right to decide when to, if we're ill, chronically ill, a right to decide when we end our life too. And I think the majority of Australians want that, but the politicians don't seem to. And I think there's sort of the similar, there's sort of similar issues that the politicians don't seem to understand, that the majority of Australians.
Well, of course, we have a parliamentary democracy, so our great legal steps are generally taken in Parliament, sometimes in the courts, but we don't have a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights, so essentially things of this kind have to be sorted out in Parliament, and on this matter, Parliament is slow to act. Now, it was interesting today at the Dimmock's lunch in Sydney, this issue arose. I should say it's not a personal issue, because Yaron and I have really talked about it, and Yaron thinks it's too early to tell whether we, after 42 years, that we should still take some time about this. So it's not personal, but it was interesting to me that a couple of people, very nice people of my age or younger, some of them even looked as though they might have been Methodists. They came up to me and said, well, couldn't we just call it something else and something different? And I said, well, I understand that point of view, but that's what they did in America for 50 years before Brown and the Board of Education said separate but equal is not a proper constitutional principle. And so I was interested to see that was the reaction still. So you have to respect people and where they are on the journey. I've had a lot of time to think things out in my head on this issue, but some people don't have a lot of time, don't want to spend a lot of time, don't want to think about this too much, and so that's their perfect right. And it really is one of those issues where a little bit of leadership wouldn't go astray. Maybe I'll live to see somebody like the Prime Minister Zapatero in Spain, who in the Cortes said, this is not being done for strangers, this is not being done for others, this is being done for our families, for our neighbours, for our co-workers, for people whom we know who have been excluded. We are inviting them in to full citizenship. It was a wonderful speech. Will I live to hear that and hear that in our House of Representatives across the way in Australia? I hope I will. I hope that what Yaron and I have done will be seen as a contribution to that it's not something to be afraid of. It's just part of nature. It's just part of the reality. Get over it. Lie down and you'll feel better tomorrow.
was up the back, so you'll have to speak loudly.
Justice Michael, it could be said that the Queen of England's greatest appointment in recent times was Archbishop Rowan Williams. In Australian society, who do you believe has been the greatest appointment of our Parliament?
Well, actually, as I was brought up as an Anglican, I don't want to sort of do promotion of the Anglican Church, but it's always seemed to me to be a denomination that from its very origins has had to be accommodating, because you'll remember it grew out of the Reformation, and it was deeply divisive because of the fact that you had successive monarchs, Mary, who was burning all the prods, and Elizabeth or Edward, who was burning all the Catholics. And so they had to adjust to end the burnings, and therefore it had to be a church that would have enough spaces for the high church and enough spaces for the low church. I happen to have been brought up in the low church tradition in Sydney, and I'm a very Protestant sort of Anglican, but I have a feeling for Archbishop Rowan Williams, because he's trying to keep the whole show on the road and keep it all together, and there's all that church property he's got to think about around the world. And so, but you've got to admit this about the Anglicans: they've had the debate about women priests, they've had the debate about women bishops, they've even in America had the consecration of a couple of gay bishops. And therefore it's sort of in a dialogue. In some other churches and in some other religions, there's no dialogue and no movement. So I understand the disappointment with some of the Anglican leaders, but on the whole, there's at least a discussion, a conversation, and that's where we'll get to a resolution. It's a bit like white Australia, in my opinion. When I grew up in the 1950s, we had white Australia. At Fort Street High School, there were about 5 Asian Australians. Now you go there and it's about 40% of the school. And wonderful kids, all speaking with Aussie accents, and I hope with Aussie values and understanding our history. But how did we overcome that? We overcame it because we began to meet Asian Australians. We began to know them. We began to know them as friends and neighbours, and to realise that some of them were even better than we were, and some of them were boring like the rest of us. So I think this is a story in progress. It'll keep having progress, but sometimes you've got to give it a little bit of a push, because some of the politicians need a bit of a push on this and other things as well.
In terms of the part of the question about appointments, I mean, fortunately the Queen doesn't get to appoint heads of churches or directly appoint anybody else in this country. And if there's a question about the Republic, I hope it'll get asked. But the
passé.
But the interesting thing is that in beginning of 2008, just when Michael was on track to retirement, there was discussion about who was going to be the next Governor-General of Australia. And it was very interesting, actually, when you think about the sweep of history. What I've tried to do in the book is cover the sweep of history on a lot of these issues, not just gay rights through the whole history of the book, but Aboriginal rights, and a whole lot of issues get played out through the course, a whole lot of very significant change that helps answer that. Well, it helps think about that question: where have we come from and where are we going? But even on that one issue of the Governor-General's appointment, The Australian, a very esteemed journal, predicted that, and Michael's name was mentioned, could he be appointed to the Governor-Generalship? Could Lowitja Donohue be appointed to the Governor-Generalship? And The Australian concluded, no government, Kevin Rudd, no government is going to waste its capital on symbolic cultural appointments. And then about 2 weeks later there was the national apology, and then shortly after that Quentin Bryce was announced as Governor-General, as the first female Governor-General. And I think that all of these events exemplify what Michael was just saying, is how long do we want to wait, letting history take its natural course in how we decide to develop ourselves into a better society, and when do things need a bit of a push? and who needs pushing and over what cliff. But Michael's never been one for pushing people over cliffs. But part of the story in the book is his skill at saying, well, we're going to give a bit of a push here, and we're going to give a bit of a push there, and we're going to do it based on rational principles.
And I'm sorry, that is the history of our institutions, and that is what Australians are comfortable with. And they like to see progress, but we've sort of got into a bit of a freeze. And I think we need to loosen things up a bit and have a bit more social progress. And
why is it, Michael, that we worship God with them, but we elect John Howard for 11 and a half years? Don't be Peterson for 11 or 14 years. Why is it in our nature that we worship people like you, but we elect people like John Howard?
I'm sure some people here voted for...
No, but can I say at the moment one very important thing. John Howard devoted huge amounts to medical research in our country. $100 million he gave in his last year in office, and at this very moment there is talk in Australia of reducing the monies being given to our great medical institutions. And they've named an institution at the University of New South Wales after me, and I'll be taking part with the Nobel laureates and others in Australia telling the present government that is false economy. You've got to spend on medical research and on other research because that is a clever society, and that's what's important. So let's not forget, John Howard, like all of our politicians, had his good and his bad points. And he was an Australian, and there are lots of things I disagreed with, but he was really good on medical research, and I hope that that'll be remembered and that our government will get back to that.
Okay, one last quick question, the gentleman in the red.
Thank you for the conversation tonight. As someone who has studied at law school, the son of a lawyer and brother of a lawyer, it's concerning that legal services seem less and less affordable. In Australia, lots of people are told that to settle their disputes, the best way to settle is outside of the court. I would have thought the whole point of the legal system is that everyone has affordable, quick, easy access to straightforward justice that is robust and that lasts the test of time. Some people suggest that legal services in Australia are less affordable than even, say, 200 years ago. You hear stories about people losing their houses, losing everything in battles in the family court. I wonder if it's not possible that legal services could be like going to the dentist or employing an electrician. To me, there's no reason why general legal services, particularly at a lower level, can't be affordable, quick, easy. Is it that we have a cabal of lawyers who want to keep a closed shop, or is it more complicated? Do you have a view on how we could make legal services more affordable in a revolutionary way, not just by tinkering at the edges?
Well, you've touched on the really central fault of our legal system. I mean, if you get to court, it is a wonderful system with uncorrupted judges, skilled lawyers, argument of cases, no outside influences, decisions, acceptance. Sheriffs don't have to enforce them generally. We all accept it. So they are the strengths, but the weakness is exactly what you've said. And it was epitomised by a German judge, the president of the Verfassungsgerichtshof, who came out here and he said, yes, in Germany we have a different system. You have a Rolls-Royce system, and all we've got is a Volkswagen system. But he then said, he left for a dramatic pause. This was in Hobart at the Australian Legal Convention. He said, but how many people can afford a Volkswagen and how many can afford a Rolls-Royce? And that question was not really answered at the conference, and it is the problem. Now, the solutions to problems were, first of all, Lionel Murphy's solution of subventions for legal aid, but then they got gobbled up mainly in criminal cases and are increasingly unavailable in civil cases. And the next was the Howard government's pro bono work by lawyers, but there's a limit to the extent to which you can ask lawyers to do things for nothing. I mean, not many plumbers do things for nothing. And therefore, the problem is a structural problem. And I agree, if you want to really change it, you've got to do something revolutionary, like introduce more features of the accusatorial system. But I used to sit there across the lake, and I always remembered, because I came from Concord, that many of the people who were there not represented were trying to get their point over, and judges of our tradition will try to help them, but there's a limit on that as well. So it's a very important question you ask, and it requires a lot of attention and urgent attention. But meantime, we go on with our Rolls-Royce system, and within that system, it works just so well. You can't even hear a clock. Everything with you.
Well, look, the mention of a clock is a reminder that time is against us. So I suggest that we pause for now and continue the conversation over. I understand there might be wine and cheese and indeed books to sign. So firstly, I'd like to thank Michael. One of the things, there are lots of wonderful, you've used so many great sources, AJ, because the book is full of such wonderful pithy quotes. And one I particularly liked was in a letter to you from Caroline Jones, which she wrote to you on your appointment to the Federal Court. And she there said that despite your move to the Federal Court, somehow, she said, I feel there will be an opportunity for you to go on communicating. And your skills as a communicator are just legendary, and that's what's brought so many of us here tonight. So thank you very much, Michael, for doing that. To AJ, I want to say I noticed in one of the flyers for the book that it's described as the first biography of the Honourable Michael Kirby. I'm not sure whether you're contemplating turning around now and doing a second, but I wanted to say that we're all grateful for the scholarly light that you've cast on Michael's life and work. And this is a work of scholarship, but at the same time you pulled off that wonderful double act of also giving us a great read. So we're indebted to you as well, AJ.